please.
Thank you very much. So before I go on to the international dimension, I had a quick question for Gerard. You mentioned the red, amber, green traffic light system. Is that the one that was in the press about the government's plans, the secret plan for an exit strategy? Have you been advising the government? Is it the same thing, or is it something completely different?
No, I'm not advising the government. Professor Ormerod and I produced the discussion paper and the policy paper, and yep. I know those papers have been widely circulated. So I'm not advising anyone of this.
You could say that it's been. You could say that it's been influenced by your thinking on this. Certainly,
I've no idea. There was a lot of similarity to what was in the press and in Professor Ormerod and my paper. So I think there's naturally some overlap.
You can take some credit for it if it comes through, and if that's the policy that's adopted then. So moving on to the international dimension, I'm going to start with Ian. Ian, as you know, there are 80 or so governments asking for emergency IMF funding. Some are suggesting, some speculation that could be, it could cost up to 2 trillion in a total bailout. And yet the support that's being given to other countries, other economies, who we do depend on for our supply chains as well, is significantly lower. Can you talk through which countries are most at risk, and also both in the economic sense, but also in terms of the humanitarian dimension? We haven't yet we're aware that millions of people could lose lives in Asia, but also in Africa. Could you just run through some of these issues for us?
Yeah, I think there is the issues in different parts of the world are obviously very different. For example, obviously yesterday we saw the oil price crash. This is going to cause massive problems for the budgets of a lot of countries around the world, particularly some of those in sub-Saharan Africa, where the Tony Blair Institute does a lot of work. So the governments that we are working with there are facing some very difficult challenges, which incidentally also reflects on their approach to the crisis and whether or not it can be similar to ours or whether it needs to be different to safeguard people's livelihoods. I'm sure Gerald will want to say more on the capacity of the IMF, but I think it's pretty much consensus that that needs to be much greater, not just to tackle the economic consequences of this crisis, but also the geopolitical instability risks that are likely to flow from the destabilization that some of these shocks could create.
Would you agree with that figure that we're looking at something around 2 trillion from the community?
It's not something I'd want to comment on, but it's definitely a big number. Okay,
and do you have but it's in the order of very significant numbers. Do you have any sense of obviously country by country we're seeing certain numbers. The WHO referred to the risk of 2 million people losing lives in Bangladesh alone. This is a country that has exports, 85% of its exports are in the garment sector. We are seeing the spectre of British companies like Asda, Primark, New Look and others who are not paying for contracts even though the products have been there, and millions of people are losing jobs, and many will lose lives as a consequence of actions of Western companies, even though we need to keep those supply chains going. Can you reflect on how multinationals are behaving in those countries, not just in Bangladesh, but other parts of the world, and what you think our governments should be doing to contain irresponsible actors in this context?
Yeah, well, it's certainly true that particularly developing countries or less developed countries that are part of global supply chains are really facing twin shocks here. They're losing their customers in particularly developed countries that are usually sucking their imports, and they're also having their own lockdowns and their own health crisis too. And those two things aren't necessarily happening at the same time. Sometimes they're getting hit in different waves by these problems. And maintaining those supply chains is going to be a key part of maintaining the supply capacity of the global economy so that we don't hit living standards. It's also going to be...
Sorry, I'm going to have to keep interjecting because I've got just a few minutes left. What do you think the British government should be doing in relation to British companies that are not paying their bills? For instance, it's in the order of 2.4 billion for Bangladesh, just on garments. Because in the last financial crisis, We had to learn the lessons of irresponsible actions by banks. What we're seeing is retailers in the ready-made garment sector, as one example. There'll be many others in other countries who are behaving appallingly. What should our government be doing to ensure that our companies behave appropriately? Because we're going to need those countries to provide, for instance, PPE and other products on a large scale if we're to get through this crisis.
Well, I think
Can I just interject very briefly? This has to be, I'm sorry, a 10-second, 15-second answer. Then I'm going to go straight to Harriet. Thank you.
I think one thing the government can do is make sure that companies in the UK have the wherewithal to maintain their supply chains and keep going. Because if those companies go bust, then the suppliers in other countries will never get.
How do you think they should do that?
Thank you. I'm going to move to Harriet now. Sorry, Rushanara, we've got to stop at 1:30, and it's only fair on Harriet. Harriet.
Thanks very much, Mel.